Part 4. Fate plus Free Will. The Omen. Chapter 10. The Election Omen. In the prior chapters, we looked at how God has given us free will, while at the same time orchestrating all things. I likened it to a pick-your-own-adventure book in which God is the author who wrote the story and all the outcomes, and we're the reader choosing the path the story takes. This is the chapter where our free will and God's predetermination come to a head. You see, God has already written the outcome for human government. Every day that passes, we move closer and closer to the one-world government under rulership of the Antichrist. Jesus Christ, God in the flesh, will rule for eternity after defeating the Antichrist. While we're progressing toward this outcome each day, it's not a straightforward linear progression where you take a step forward each day. Instead, we're progressing in a cyclical fashion. A cycle is simply a period of time in which a sequence of events transpires. You're going to see that during each cycle we either progress toward the final human government, hold our ground, or actually take a step away from the Antichrist government. What's more interesting is that as we examine these cycles, a pattern emerges that we can apply to today. Get ready, because the election omen will be revealed. Let's start our journey by discussing the cycles. If you've read the books of 1st and 2nd Kings in the Bible, you'll be familiar with Israel's sin cycle. The people started out with a godly leader and by worshiping God. Then they got a ruler who drew them away from God, and they started worshiping false gods. Then the evil, ungodly ruler oppressed the people until they finally sought God for help. God delivered them by giving them another godly leader. Then the cycle repeated. King David is the gold standard for good kings. He followed and obeyed God with all of his heart, 1 Kings 14:8. He had a heart like God, Acts 13:22. When he was ruler, the people did not advance toward evil or the Antichrist government. However, that quickly changed with the next rulers. Thus, the cycle begins. Once David died, his son Solomon became king. Solomon started out doing good, but crashed and burned. He did evil because he married a lot of foreign wives, built altars for his wives' false gods, worshipped those false gods, and ultimately turned the people away from God. 1 Kings 11. The people took a step towards Satan and his Antichrist government. When King Solomon died, God split the nation of Israel in two, Judah and Israel. Israel never had a godly ruler after the split. All of its rulers did evil in God's eyes. All they did was take steps towards Satan until they were captured by the Assyrians. Judah, on the other hand, is where we clearly see cycles and a pattern. King Solomon's son, Rehoboam, became king of Judah, and he did more evil than King Solomon, 1 Kings 14:22. So here, we see the people took yet another step toward Satan. After Rehoboam died, his son Abijam was king, and he did the same kind of evil, 1 Kings 15:3. The people held their ground. They didn't advance toward Satan. The next ruler of Judah was King Asa, Abijam's son. Now he did good in God's eyes. In fact, God compares him to King David, 1 Kings 15:11. So here we see the cycle complete. The cycle started with good King David and progressed to a King Rehoboam type of evil with King Abijam, before God delivered the people and gave them another godly ruler, King Asa. In that cycle, the people took a couple steps towards Satan. Let's look at this next cycle that starts with King Asa. The cycle started when the people took a step toward God and away from Satan. After Asa died, his son Jehoshaphat became king, and he did good like his father. However, God tells us he didn't remove the pagan shrines, 1 Kings 22:43. So, let's say the people took a tiny step towards Satan. The next king was Jehoram, Jehoshaphat's son. He committed evil like Israel's king Ahab did, 1 Kings 8:18. That's a whole new level of evil. Of all the evil kings in the Bible, Ahab is the most wicked. 1 Kings 16:29 through 33. He's the polar opposite of King David. Just like God compares good kings to King David, he compares evil kings to King Ahab. Here we see the people took a leap towards Satan and the final human government during King Jehoram's reign. The cycle continued to progress with Jehoram's son, King Ahaziah, who did the same kind of evil as Ahab, 2 Kings 8:27. It's not until we get to King Joash, Ahaziah's son, that we see a godly ruler again. Now he wasn't compared to King David because he didn't destroy all the altars of the foreign gods, 2 Kings 12:2 through 3. The people only took a small step back toward God this time. When we continue to examine the cycles, let's see what emerges. Cycle 1 begins with King David, godly, gold standard, and ends with King Abijam, evil, like King Rehoboam. Cycle 2 begins with King Asa, like godly King David, and ends with King Ahaziah, like the most wicked King Ahab. Cycle 3 begins with King Joash, good, but not like King David, and it ends with King Ahaz, evil like King Ahab, 2 Kings 16:2 through 3. Cycle 4 starts with King Hezekiah, good like King David, 2 Kings 18:3, and finishes with King Amen, evil like King Ahab, 2 Kings 21:20 through 22. Cycle 5 kicks off with King Josiah, good like King David, 2 Kings 22:2, and terminates with King Zedekiah, evil like Ahab, 2 Kings 24:19. That's the last of the cycles. It's during King Zedekiah's reign that the people of Judah were taken captive to Babylon. Did you notice a pattern? The people started with the gold standard of godly rulers with King David. As they moved away from God and toward Satan, the rulers became more wicked until they couldn't get any more wicked than King Ahab. Once they got to that level of evil, they always returned to it after the godly king. What's more is that cycle 4 and 5 illustrate the rulership of polar opposites. The people had the most wicked rulers, and then a ruler who was like King David. And here lies a key truth in the election omen. Keep in mind that an omen is a prophecy, warning, or sign of a future event. A nation will advance in wickedness until it reaches the polar opposite of God. They abandoned Yahweh, the God of their fathers, who brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods, of the gods of the peoples who were around them, and bowed themselves down to them, and they provoked Yahweh to anger. Yahweh raised up judges who saved them out of the hand of those who plundered them. Yet they didn't listen to their judges, for they prostituted themselves to other gods, and bowed themselves down to them. They quickly turned away from the way in which their fathers walked, obeying Yahweh's commandments. They didn't do so, but when the judge was dead, they turned back and dealt more corruptly than their fathers in following other gods to serve them and to bow down to them. They didn't cease what they were doing or give up their stubborn ways. Judges 2:12, 16 through 17, and 19. As the verses above show us, this same pattern was evident during Israel's time of judges. After Moses and Joshua died, the people turned away from God. God sent judges to save them and turn them back, but they always dealt more corruptly than their fathers. They continued to sin more and more each time they turned away. You may be wondering why the cycles didn't keep going. Why didn't God send the people another godly ruler after King Zedekiah? Let's see what God told the prophet Jeremiah. Yahweh said to me, "Proclaim all these words in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem, saying, Hear the words of this covenant and do them. For I earnestly protested to your fathers in the day that I brought them up out of the land of Egypt, even to this day, rising early and protesting, saying, Obey my voice. Yet they didn't obey, nor turned their ear, but everyone walked in the stubbornness of their evil heart. Therefore I brought on them all the words of this covenant, which I commanded them to do, but they didn't do them. Jeremiah 11:6-8. God gave them a prophet who warned them what would happen if they didn't follow God. Jeremiah warned the people that judgment was coming. He even told them Nebuchadnezzar was going to invade. As the scripture above says, they refused to listen. They had evil, stubborn hearts. That's a heart like Satan. The people had reached the point of no return. God didn't give them a godly king because the people didn't want one. They didn't want to repent and turn back to God. That's why God sent a foreign ruler, King Nebuchadnezzar, to take them into captivity. Thus, another piece of the election omen is revealed. When a nation turns completely away from God and reaches the point of no return, it will bring judgment upon itself. Everyone who passes by it will be astonished and say, "Why has Yahweh done this to this land and to this house?" They shall answer, "Because they abandoned Yahweh, the God of their fathers, who brought them out of the land of Egypt, and took other gods, worshipped them, and served them. Therefore he has brought all this evil on them." 2 Chronicles 7:21-22. The scripture above shows us that God warned the people about his judgment when King Solomon reigned. Yet the judgment isn't entirely bad for the people. Wicked and oppressive rulers have a way of sparking revival. That's because people who are oppressed think back on their past when they had it better, and they remember God. God knew they would remember him and cry out to him for help during their oppression in Babylon. You may recall from a prior chapter that King Nebuchadnezzar ended up turning to God as well. Daniel 4. So, we see that God ultimately used this calamity for good. That's another truth in the election omen. A nation under an oppressive ruler will remember God and seek him once again. The Egyptians mistreated us, afflicted us, and imposed hard labor on us. Then we cried to Yahweh, the God of our fathers. Yahweh heard our voice and saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression. Yahweh brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand, with an outstretched arm, with great terror, with signs and with wonders. Deuteronomy 26:6-8. I also want you to notice that Jeremiah was told to remind the people of the covenant. They were supposed to be obeying it, and they weren't. This is referring to the covenant God gave the Israelites through Moses. God had rescued the people from Egyptian captivity, and they were getting ready to enter the promised land. Deuteronomy 28-30. It's a prophecy that describes the blessings they'd get if they obeyed God, and the curses they'd get if they didn't. The blessings that are promised include abundant crops and livestock, God conquering their enemies, prosperity, many children, and them lending to nations instead of borrowing. Their nation would be awed. Now, if they didn't obey, they'd get the curses, which include frustration with everything they did, diseases, scorching heat and drought, no rain, locusts, defeat by their enemies, panic, oppression, and exile. Their nation would be ridiculed. So what did the covenant entail? What were they supposed to be doing? Behold, I have set before you today life and prosperity, and death and evil. For I command you today to love Yahweh your God, to walk in his ways and to keep his commandments, his statutes, and his ordinances, that you may live and multiply, and that Yahweh your God may bless you in the land where you go in to possess it. But if your heart turns away, and you will not hear, but are drawn away and worship other gods, and serve them, I declare to you today that you will surely perish. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today, that I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. Therefore, choose life that you may live, you and your descendants, to love Yahweh your God, to obey his voice, and to cling to him. For he is your life, and the length of your days, that you may dwell in the land which Yahweh swore to your father, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give them. Deuteronomy 30:15-20. It's simple. They were supposed to love God. When you love someone with all your heart, you naturally want to do things that please them. If we love God, we'll desire to obey Him. The more we love God, the more our heart becomes like God's heart. So the people got to a point that they no longer loved God. They didn't want anything to do with Him. So God gave them exactly what they wanted. He gave them a foreign ruler who didn't know God, Nebuchadnezzar. There's a key truth here that further reveals the election omen. God gives a nation the ruler they desire. Yes, they knew God, but they wouldn't worship Him as God or even give Him thanks. And they begin to think up foolish ideas of what God was like. As a result, their minds became dark and confused. And instead of worshiping the glorious, ever-living God, they worshipped idols made to look like mere people and birds and animals and reptiles. So God abandoned them to do whatever shameful things their hearts desired. Romans 1:21-23-24. If the majority of people in a nation want to follow God, they'll get a godly ruler. However, if they don't, then of course the opposite will happen. You must remember that we all have free will. We live in a country in which we get to exercise our free will and elect leaders. God honors the choices we make with the free will that He gives us. He then uses our free will to accomplish His purposes. He knows the outcome and consequences of the choices we make. The ruler of a nation reflects the collective attitudes and beliefs of the nation. What's more is that the leader is a key instrument in determining the future course of a nation. Remember that if Satan can get the ruler to sin, the people will follow. Just think of all the kings in the Bible who built idols for the people to worship. Even Aaron created a golden calf for the people to worship while Moses was on the mountain with God. Aaron created the calf because the people asked him to. Exodus 32. You know, he could have said no, but he didn't, because he had the same attitude the people did. This is also clear from the cycles we looked at earlier, because as the cycles progressed, the rulers continued to get more and more evil until they reached the King Ahab level of wickedness. That's why it's so important for us to vote for leaders who have hearts that Jesus can get inside and act through. Otherwise, Satan will fill their heart instead. Now, let's apply what we've learned to today. Do you think we're following this biblical pattern? First, let's start by considering if the U.S. has any tie to the Mosaic covenant and the blessings and curses. What's really fascinating is not only is there a connection, but it's been there since the very beginning of our nation. Our very first president, George Washington, spoke these words during his inauguration speech in 1789. It would be peculiarly improper to omit in this first official act my fervent supplications to that Almighty Being who rules over the universe, who presides in the councils of nations, and whose providential aids can supply every human defect, that His benediction may consecrate to the liberties and happiness of the people of the United States a government instituted by themselves for these essential purposes, and may enable every instrument employed in its administration to execute with success the functions allotted to His charge. In tendering this homage to the great author of every public and private good, I assure myself that it expresses your sentiments not less than my own, nor those of my fellow citizens at large, less than either. No people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than the people of the United States. Every step by which they have advanced to the character of an independent nation seems to have been distinguished by some token of providential agency. Since we ought to be no less persuaded that the propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right which heaven itself has ordained. And since the preservation of the sacred fire of liberty and the destiny of the republican model of government are justly considered as deeply, perhaps as finally staked on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people. In his first official act, Washington made a fervent supplication, that's a heartfelt prayer, to God. He asked God to consecrate the government in its purpose to provide liberties and happiness to the people of the United States. Consecrate means to make sacred or set apart to worship God. That's what God's chosen people, the Israelites, are, set apart to worship God. Washington further states that his homage or respect for God expresses the people's sentiments as well. So now, this entire prayer applies to all the people and the nation. Then he confirms the covenant, just like Moses did before they entered the promised land, when he said, "We can't expect the blessings or smiles of heaven if we disregard God's eternal rules." So, what are God's eternal rules? It's the 10 Commandments, Exodus 20. But Washington and the people of his time had the New Testament, which sums up God's rules nicely. In fact, this particular scripture is spoken by Jesus himself. One of the scribes asked him, "Which commandment is the greatest of all?" Jesus answered, "The greatest is, 'Hear Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength.' This is the first commandment. The second is like this, 'You shall love your neighbor as yourself.' There is no other commandment greater than these." Mark 12:28-31. Love the Lord your God with all your heart. That's what God requires of us. You see, if we love God, we'll naturally love the things God loves, including our neighbor. This is the exact same command that God gave the people of Israel before they entered the promised land. Deuteronomy 30:15-20. This is the command the covenant hinges upon. If the nation loves God, the nation is blessed. If the nation turns from God and abandons their love for him, the nation is cursed. You know, George Washington and Moses have a lot in common. God used both of them to deliver people from bondage. Moses rescued the Israelites from slavery under Pharaoh, and Washington was commander of the Continental Army during the American Revolutionary War against Great Britain. God used both of them to establish and lead a new nation. Moses led Israel, and Washington led the U.S. God was with both leaders and established his covenant with the people through them. Moses proclaimed God's covenant to the people before they entered the promised land. We read above that Washington established God's covenant with America on his inauguration day. We, the people of the U.S., are indeed tied to the Mosaic covenant and God's blessings and curses. Because of this, we can apply the cycles we learned about to the U.S. as well. So, what do the cycles reveal for the U.S.? Where are we in the progression toward the polar opposite rulers and the point of no return? Well, unless you've been living under a rock the last few years, I'm sure you've noticed our country seems more divided today than it has in the past. In particular, we're divided about our politics, government, and our president. It seems like President Donald Trump is the polar opposite of President Barack Obama, doesn't it? The Democratic Party hates Trump so much that they've done everything they can think of to remove him from office. The level of attacks he's received from the Democrats and the media hasn't happened to a president before. In the 2016 presidential election, 79% of evangelical Christians voted for Trump, while 60% of atheists and agnostics voted for Clinton. What if we look at the 2008 presidential election between Obama and McCain? Turns out, 88% of evangelical Christians voted for McCain, while 76% of atheists and agnostics voted for Obama. Wow! There is very clearly a spiritual divide among who votes for particular rulers. The United States has most certainly arrived at the time of polar opposite rulers. We're seeing the fulfillment of the election omen, and we're already quite far into the cycle of progression. So, have we reached the point of no return? Is God's judgment coming? There's another cycle and pattern I want to look at with you before we consider how far along we are on God's timetable. I hope all of you reading this are aware that we are indeed living in the end times. It's the period of time before Jesus' second coming. The biggest sign of his soon return is the nation of Israel. God prophesied his people would once again be a nation when Jesus returns. Isaiah 66, Ezekiel 36 through 37, Joel 3:2. That happened in May of 1948. Israel had ceased being a unified nation after King Solomon's reign. They were taken into Babylonian captivity in 586 BC. Although they returned to their land 70 years later, they were never a nation again until 1948. It's only been 53 years since Jerusalem was restored to the nation of Israel in 1967. Since we're living in the end and I've established that cycles are important, we must look at the very beginning to discover the next pattern. After God created the earth and Adam and Eve, the population multiplied. Although the people didn't have a ruler, they still followed the truths revealed in the election omen. The people advanced in wickedness until they were as wicked as Satan. In fact, they were so evil that God was sorry he ever made people. That's when the people reached the point of no return and brought judgment upon themselves. God flooded the entire earth and destroyed everyone and everything. Genesis 6 through 8. God saved the only person who loved him, Noah. Noah chose God while everyone else chose Satan. God gave all of them what they asked for. In the time between the flood and when God established kings for his people, two events stand out. The first is the Tower of Babel. After the flood, God told the people to spread out and fill the earth. They disobeyed and did the opposite. When they got together in one city and built a tower that could reach up into the heavens, so they went up instead of out. It was an act of defiance. They wanted to be like God and live where God lives. They were full of pride and worshipped themselves. That sounds like Satan, doesn't it? Once again, we see the cycle and election omen manifest. The people turned from God toward Satan and brought judgment on themselves. God stopped their construction project, gave them all different languages, and made them spread out over the earth. Genesis 11. The second event is the evil Egyptian ruler, Pharaoh. Just like what happened after King David, the people continued to sin, commit evil, and worship false gods. They reached the point of no return and ended up as slaves of Pharaoh. What's crazy is that they willingly chose to be slaves. They sold all of their possessions and themselves to Pharaoh in exchange for food. They trusted Pharaoh to take care of them instead of God. Genesis 47. Just as the election omen foretells, God gave the people the ruler they wanted, Pharaoh. When they finally cried out to God, he sent Moses to rescue the people from that oppression with all sorts of powerful signs and miracles so they would know God and trust in him. Exodus 7 through 11. Let's look at the pattern we see in these events I just described in reverse order. Step 7 is God's deliverance with powerful signs from the evil ruler, Pharaoh. Moving backward, Step 6 is life under the evil ruler, Pharaoh. Step 5 is when God directly intervened after they built the Tower of Babel. Step 4 is when they had a centralized government and built the Tower of Babel because they desired to be God. Continuing in reverse, Step 3 is where we get to the time of righteous Noah after the flood. Step 2 is when God destroyed the world with the flood. Lastly, Step 1 is when God created the earth. Now, let's overlay that pattern above to what the Bible tells us the future holds. It's going to be quite revealing. Since we're living in the end times, the next event the Bible tells us to be expecting is the rapture. 1 Thessalonians 4:16 through 17. It's when Jesus removes the people who've put their faith in him from what's coming on the earth. They'll be safely residing in heaven. This harkens back to Step 7, God's deliverance from Pharaoh with powerful signs. The rapture will certainly be a powerful deliverance. After the rapture, the people left behind will live under the rule of the Antichrist. Revelation 13. We're going to learn more about him in a later chapter. For now, you just need to know he'll be the most evil ruler. It'll be like step 6 when the Israelites lived under evil Pharaoh's rule. The time period after the rapture and before Jesus' second coming is called the tribulation period, because of the great anguish that people will experience. Mark 13:19. That's because God will be directly intervening by sending all sorts of judgments and plagues against the Antichrist and mankind. Revelation 6-19. Many judgments are eerily similar to the plagues God sent against Pharaoh. So this is like a mix of step 6 and step 5, when God directly intervened after they built the Tower of Babel and sent judgments against Pharaoh. Another interesting thing that happens during the tribulation period is that the Antichrist establishes and rules over a centralized world government in which everyone worships him. Revelation 13. He even declares himself God. 2 Thessalonians 2:4. The people's worship shows their agreement and devotion to him and the world government. It's like step 4 when our ancestors got together in one city and built the Tower of Babel so they could be like God, isn't it? Continuing our progression forward, we get to Jesus' second coming and his reign upon the earth, Revelation 20. That's like the time right after the flood, when righteous Noah lived on the earth, step 3. After Jesus' 1,000-year reign on the earth, God will destroy the earth in a great fire, Revelation 21, 2 Peter 3:5-7. That's very much like step 2 above when God destroyed the earth the first time with a flood. Lastly, God will create a new earth and a new heaven, just like in step 1. Please refer to the table below to see a side-by-side comparison of what we just learned. Moses to creation. 7. God's deliverance from Pharaoh with powerful signs. 6. Evil Pharaoh rules the people. 5. God intervenes and judges the people. 4. Tower of Babel and centralized government. 3. Righteous Noah. 2. God's destruction of the earth with the flood. 1. God creates the heavens and the earth. Today to eternity. 1. The rapture. Deliverance from tribulation and a powerful sign. 2. Evil Antichrist rules the people. 3. God intervenes with tribulation judgments. 4. Antichrist one world government. 5. Jesus' second coming and his 1,000-year reign. 6. God's destruction of the earth with fire. 7. God creates a new heaven and a new earth. This is really intriguing. The pattern reveals that the end of times will play out like the beginning of times, only in reverse order. It's almost as if God is undoing what was done. In a way, he is doing just that. When Adam and Eve sinned, it infected and cursed all of God's creation. The Bible tells us how God plans to redeem us, restore us, and undo the curse of sin. Romans 8. If you want to be included in God's redemption and perhaps even get raptured, all you have to do is put your faith in Jesus. The key to understanding if the U.S. has reached the point of no return is figuring out how close we are to the Antichrist's reign. Remember, the election omen foretells that once a nation reaches that point of no return, that judgment comes upon it. The Bible tells us what that judgment is that's coming. It's the tribulation period, when the Antichrist is the ruler, and there's a centralized one-world government. A distinguishing factor of the Antichrist's reign is the one-world government. You know we already have the foundation of that in place today. It's the United Nations. Let's discover when we as a globe decided to start creating our modern-day Tower of Babel and world government. We have to go way back to 1920. Yes, that's right. It's been 100 years. I find that a bit ominous, don't you? The League of Nations was created right after World War I. The U.S. had an instrumental role in its creation. President Wilson won the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. Even though our country helped create it, we weren't a member of it. The League of Nations ultimately failed in its goal of preventing another world war, and it dissolved in 1946, when it transferred all of its assets to the United Nations. As you likely guessed, the United Nations was created in 1945 as a result of World War II. Once again, our nation played a key role in its creation. However, this time, the U.S. was one of the founding member nations. The key difference between the United Nations and the one world government is that each country still has national sovereignty today. When the Antichrist reigns, they won't. Of the 195 countries in the world today, 193 are in the United Nations. Wow, I'd say that's a really clear sign that we're close to the Antichrist's global government. Another indicator we can look at is the rise of pharaohs, or dictators. The Antichrist will be the ultimate evil dictator. After the people built the Tower of Babel, the next key event was their enslavement by Pharaoh. So let's see if there's any progression toward dictators, or if democracy still reigns today. After World War I, 3 notable dictators rose to power. Stalin ruled over the Soviet Union, Hitler ruled over Germany, and Mussolini ruled Italy. All of them persecuted people and committed genocide. Millions of people died under these rulers. Hitler even started World War II when he invaded Poland. I think we can all agree that these are notorious bad guys. So what about after World War II? After World War II, democracy flourished for a period of time. However, we still had dictators. The first dictator who comes to mind is Mao Zedong, who ruled China. Like the dictators before him, he also committed mass genocide. It's estimated 40 to 80 million people died during his reign. That makes him the most wicked 20th century dictator. Yes, even worse than Hitler. A non-profit organization, Freedom House, prepares annual reports on freedom across the world. It's a left-leaning partisan publication, but it has some valuable insights. They look at trends in the types of governments and rulers. Back in 2000, their report said, "The middle of the 20th century also witnessed the spread of totalitarian communism as an alternative form of government, under which a third of the world's population then lived." So, about 70 years ago, 1/3 of the world had a dictator. That's a lot. So, how about now? Here are some statements from their latest report published in 2020. Democracy and pluralism are under assault. 2019 was the 14th consecutive year of decline in global freedom. Ethnic, religious, and other minority groups have borne the brunt of government abuses in both democracies and authoritarian states. The unchecked brutality of autocratic regimes and the ethical decay of democratic powers are combining to make the world increasingly hostile to fresh demands for better governance. Their 2020 report illustrates that 25 of 41, 61%, established democracies suffered overall declines in freedom over the past 14 years. For the last 14 years, democracy across the globe has declined. Let's look at the freedom score they give the top 10 most populous nations, so we can see how good or bad things are. These countries account for 57% of the world population. The scale is 0 to 100, with 0 being not free at all, meaning the country has a dictator, and 100 being totally free. As you can see in the table, only 3 of the 10 countries are considered free. What's equally disturbing is that for 7 of the countries, their freedom score declined from last year. Did you also realize that 2 of the biggest countries on the planet are dictatorships, China and Russia? The time of evil pharaohs or dictators is certainly upon us as well. Country, 2020 score, designation, change from 2019. China, 10, not free, declined. India, 71, free, declined. United States, 86, free, unchanged. Indonesia, 61, partly free, declined. Pakistan, 38, partly free, declined. Brazil, 75, free, unchanged. Nigeria, 47, partly free, declined. Bangladesh, 39, partly free, declined. Russia, 20, not free, unchanged. Mexico, 62, partly free, declined. So what's in store for us? What does the election omen foretell? The closer we get to the tribulation period, the more we'll start to see the polar opposite rulers, the election omen reveals. After all, the very end will feature the Antichrist and Jesus Christ as rulers. The polar opposites have certainly manifested today in the U.S. with Trump versus the Democrats, Republicans versus Democrats, and democracy versus socialism and communism. The closer we get to the tribulation period, the closer we're going to get to an Antichrist-like leader and an Antichrist-like global government. The foundation for the Antichrist global government is already in place, and pretty much every country is on board. All that's lacking is the Antichrist. The progression we'll continue to see is the decline of democracy. That's because the Antichrist will be a dictator who controls everything. People won't be able to participate in his economy unless they have his mark. He'll have the ultimate government control of the world's production. The Antichrist will be a communist. The ominous sign for the U.S. is that one of the front-runners in the Democratic Party presidential campaign was Bernie Sanders. Sanders just recently, the second week of April 2020, officially dropped out of the race and endorsed Biden. About a week prior, Bernie had just suspended his campaign, hadn't endorsed Biden, and was holding on to his delegates to exert influence at the convention. Do you know what happened? Here's what Sanders said in his announcement endorsing Biden. "I have been very pleased that your staff and my staff have been working together over the last several weeks to coming up with a number of task forces that will look at some of the most important issues facing this country." Here are some things Biden said in response to the endorsement. "Bernie, I want to thank you for that. It's a big deal. Your endorsement means a great deal to me. I think people are surprised that we are apart on some issues, but we're awfully close on a bunch of others. I'm going to need you, not just to win the campaign, but to govern." So Sanders is now working with Biden to influence Biden's policies. The result is going to be a co-policy, something that both Bernie and Joe support. Because of this recent development, it's important for us to understand both candidates' views on the issues, which we'll do in each chapter on the issues. We can't lose sight of Sanders. At the least, it appears Biden has plans to include Sanders in his government, should he win. Could Sanders be his vice president pick? Some interesting things could happen this summer. Like the Antichrist, Sanders is also a communist. That's not a popular or good stance to have amongst people who know history. So they're telling you he's a democratic socialist. There's no such thing. He's in the same camp as Stalin. With the coronavirus outbreak, we've seen the Democrat Party try to hold relief bills hostage in order to put through some of their socialist and Green New Deal policies. It doesn't matter who gets the Democratic nomination. That party will continue to push socialist and communist measures. What we have shaping up for the 2020 presidential election is a communist-leaning party versus a democracy-loving capitalist. It's another polar opposite. Since someone who supports the same type of economic system the Antichrist will enforce is quite popular in the United States today, I believe we're not too far from the rapture. Believers, get ready to meet Jesus in the clouds. This progression we're seeing is happening because of what the election omen foretells. God will give a nation, the people, the ruler they desire. When people reject God, they're asking for his polar opposite. That's the Antichrist. That's who's coming. It's going to happen. It's just a matter of time. A life apart from God is a life condemned to hell. Unfortunately, that's exactly what the Antichrist will usher in on earth. The tribulation period will be hell on earth. Most of the people alive during that time will die at his hand or by God's judgments. There's good news, though. We believers are still here. That means the Antichrist can't rise to power yet. We have to get raptured first. 2 Thessalonians 2. Until that day happens, we have enormous power and influence, and we must use it in this spiritual war. Today, more than ever, we must stand against evil and the progression towards Satan and away from God. Think of all the people who don't know Jesus yet, people you care about and love. We must hope that God continues to give them time to come to know Him. The point of no return will come, but it's not here yet. It's imperative that we all vote for the person with the heart like Jesus's, who will stem the tide of evil. I looked for someone who might rebuild the wall of righteousness that guards the land. I searched for someone to stand in the gap in the wall so I wouldn't have to destroy the land, but I found no one. Ezekiel 22:30 NLT. Jesus is looking for brave people to rebuild the wall of righteousness that guards our nation. Today, you have a decision to make. It's the same decision the Israelites had to make before they entered the promised land. It's the choice between life and death, following God or not. Choose to love God with all your heart. Choose to obey Him no matter the cost. Choose to stand with Him today. Join me and stand in the gap in the wall.